So I want to welcome you all to the SAGE-CASBS Award Lecture, which is co-presented by SAGE Publishing and the Center for Advanced Study in Behavioral Sciences, CASBS, at Stanford. The award was established in 2013 to recognize outstanding achievement in the behavioral and social sciences that advance our understanding of pressing social issues. It underscores the role of the social and behavioral sciences in enriching and enhancing public policy and good governance. SAGE Publishing is the proud funder of the award. I'm about to acknowledge Sarah, but I realized I didn't introduce myself, so in case you don't know, I'm so excited to see Srinija. So in case you don't know me, I am Margaret Levy, and I am the current director of the Center of CASBS. And I'm also very happy to introduce Woody Powell, who will be the next director, the interim director of CASBS. But I also very much want to acknowledge the presence of SAGE Publishing founder and executive chair, Sarah Miller McCune. I am the Sarah Miller McCune director of CASBS, thanks to Sarah's generous endowment of the directorship. I spoke about her last night. We had a wonderful event at President Mark Tessier-Levine's house to honor Sarah for all that she has given to CASBS. And I'll repeat a little of that now, though I'll try not to cry. Sarah is an inspiring figure who has had a huge, bigger influence on me than she realizes. As I told her last night, I remember meeting her many, many years ago when I was on the editorial board of a journal called Politics and Society, and SAGE had just bought it. And I was so thrilled, one, that SAGE had bought it, and that I got to meet Sarah Miller McCune, because she broke all kinds of glass ceilings. She's done remarkable things for publishing, transformed the way we think about social sciences through her role as an editor and publisher, and has been an incredible friend of the Center for Advanced Study in Behavioral Sciences for a very long time. She was on the board of directors, the board of trustees of CASBS. She's now emerita, having felt like, we didn't tell her to leave, but she felt like she had served her time, and we couldn't persuade her otherwise, but we convinced her to be emerita. She's also turned out to be a really good friend, not just of the center, but of me and my husband, Bob Kaplan, who's hiding somewhere in the back there, and of virtually anyone who comes under her influence. And so it's really lovely to have you here and to have you once again sponsoring this award. And we'll hear from Sarah today after the lecture when she actually presents the award itself. I also want to note that Clive Perry is here. He's supposed to be sitting there, but he must be somewhere. He's back there. You have a seat up here if you want it, Clive. Who's SAGE Publishing's Global Vice President, Marketing and Communications. So it's very nice to have Clive here, who's also proved to be a very good friend of the center over the years, and certainly of social sciences. The first 5 winners of the SAGE-CASBS Prize were psychologist and Nobel laureate Daniel Kahneman, who was a CASBS fellow you're getting embarrassed, in 1977 to 78. That is a hard act to follow, but wait to hear the rest of them. You deserve it, Jen. I keep telling you, you deserve it. Sociologist and education rights activist Pedro Noguera, political scientist and former U.S. Census Bureau director and twice president of the SSRC, Kenneth Pruitt, who was also a CASBS fellow in 1983-84 and a longtime member of the board of directors. Renowned scholar of race, poverty, and inequality, not just Jen, who is also that, but William Julius Wilson, a CASBS fellow in 1981-82, and mindset science pioneer Carol Dweck. So now let me turn to the 6th winner of the SAGE-CASBS Award, today's speaker, Jennifer Richeson, who is the Philip R. Allen Professor of Psychology and head of the Social Perception and Communication Lab at Yale University, despite efforts to persuade her to be elsewhere. Given COVID, we've waited nearly 2 years for this event to have Jen here in person, so that we didn't want to do this as a Zoom event. It's really important to do this as an in-person event. So we had to wait. But by waiting, we also got her to be a fellow at CASBS this year, so it was a win-win. And I'm really happy to see her and all of you here today to hear this wonderful lecture. Jen is one of the most influential and cutting-edge social scientists on the planet today. Those are Mike Gattani's words that he wrote for me, but I share them. It was stuff I did not edit that he gave me. Her research explores cultural diversity and the behavioral dynamics of intergroup interactions. She examines ways in which gender, race, and socioeconomic status influence how people think, perceive, and behave, particularly when they interact with members of different social and cultural groups. This includes investigating how people from culturally devalued groups and from traditionally dominant groups experience and respond to societal diversity, inequality, and injustice. She also explores the antecedents and consequences of prejudice and stereotyping. Richeson is the author of more than 100 peer-reviewed journal articles and book chapters. Her work and its insights have garnered numerous awards, including, and I will not list them all, I'm only going to list a few. She's a MacArthur Foundation Fellow, a Genius Award in 2007, and not the only one in the room. Nice to see you, Jennifer. Another Jennifer. And if I missed any of the other MacArthur Fellows, I'm sorry. A John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation Fellowship in 2015. The Mamie Phipps Clark and Kenneth B. Clark Distinguished Lecture Award from Columbia University in 2019. A Carnegie Foundation Senior Fellow in 2020. A few awards. And that's, as I said, only a small percentage. Richeson also is an elected fellow of the National Academy of Sciences, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the Society of Experimental Social Psychology, and just recently, the American Academy of Political and Social Sciences, and I don't think the list has yet ended. And I'm proud to say, as I said, a current CASBS Fellow. We honor Jen today for how influential her work and findings have been on the public thinking and on policy. Her appointment to the President's Council on Science and Technology, PCAST, in 2021 is just one example. Another is her influential article in The Atlantic in 2020 on racial progress, or the myth of racial progress. That piece foreshadowed some of what she has been doing this year and what we'll be hearing her talk about in a few minutes. Finally, on a personal note, I started telling her, I can't even begin to tell you how much I've enjoyed getting to know Jen better. We had met, but really hadn't gotten to know each other, despite the fact that we're both from Baltimore and went to the same public high school for women, many years apart, and despite our common love for crab and crab cakes. But having her at CASBS has been a real gift to me, indeed to all of us. She's a model community member who inspires and, when needed, mentors other fellows, including some of us very senior fellows. Indeed, we've all learned from her, and she's fun. And now, ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to introduce the 6th winner of the SAGE-CASBS Award, Jennifer Richeson.
Thank you so much, Margaret. My goodness. And I'm supposed to talk after this? I am incredibly honored and moved by those words, and also to be the 6th winner of this prestigious award. I mean, you heard the names that came before me, and it's complicated. It's hard to be even spoken in the same breath as those towering figures. So I hope to press on and make you both proud. Sarah, I also really want to take a moment to thank you for your incredibly steadfast commitment and support of the social and behavioral sciences, being it publishing, funding research, funding young scholars, especially early career scholars. You and SAGE have been there to celebrate, to promote, to develop our social science in all of its best and most creative ways, and especially the social science for social good. So thank you. Okay, so good evening. Come on. All right now. I'm from a call and response culture. I am delighted to talk about some of the work I've been doing with you all on the mythology of racial progress. To begin this evening, I just want to introduce you to this gentleman. His name is Bob Smith. And this photo was taken on June 3rd of 2020 when Mr. Smith decided to stage a protest at a federal courthouse in Gulfport, Mississippi, close to where he now resides. Of course, June 3rd, 2020 was just after we learned about the murder of George Floyd at the hands of the Minneapolis Police Department. And Mr. Smith, then 75 years old, like many of us, felt compelled to do something, to take a stand, to really make it known that police brutality certainly is something that we cannot tolerate in our country, right? To take a stand for freedom and equality. But this was not Mr. Smith's first or even second protest, right? Indeed, you can see him here, pictured with Stokely Carmichael, the former head of SNCC, on what has now become called Bloody Sunday. This was in 1965 in Selma, Alabama, at the Edmund Pettus Bridge, when that peaceful protest was disrupted by police at the time, saying that they did not have a right to assemble, right? This is the same protest that left former Congressman John Lewis bloodied and beaten, and he was not alone. Okay? So as the story gained some attention on social media, both Mr. Smith's heroism and his commitment to his childhood home have been widely lauded. At the same time, many Americans openly lamented, how could this all be happening again in 2020? I thought we had made progress. Of course, to me, someone who's been studying this for some time and really trying to grapple with how people respond and think about and reason about inequality, it felt like for many Americans, for the first time, their faith in what I call the mythology of racial progress had been shattered, or at least weakened. So what is the mythology of racial progress? Well, this is a narrative, a dominant story that we have in our country about ourselves, about our country, right? That really, understands that at some point in the past, right, there was, we weren't very racially egalitarian. Maybe this is slavery for you, maybe it's in the treatment of Native Americans. But we're steadily, automatically, readily making progress toward greater racial equality, and that's evidenced by, the civil rights movement and the legislation that came from that. For some, it's, the election of Barack Obama as the first Black president of the United States, right? These are seen as inflection points, maybe even speeding our progress en route to this predestined outcome of racial equality. Okay. The problem with this story, like most stories, especially this one that's taken on this sort of mythic space in our national imagination, is that it shapes what we see and how we perceive the actual state of racial inequality, we argue, And it misshapes it. It leads to misperceptions. I'll show you some evidence of. And of course, how much racial equality or inequality we perceive shapes what, if anything, we think is necessary to engender that equality that we all say we want. In fact, one outcome of the mythology of racial progress, right, is that it's happening automatically, naturally, and on its own. So why do anything to move it along? So this evening, right now, I'm going to present some evidence in favor of this idea that we, meaning those of us who think about racial equality, even those who don't think about it that much, allow this mythology of racial progress to pattern what we think about the current state of racial inequality, in fact, racial inequality across time. I'm going to mostly focus on data that we've collected looking at the misperception of racial economic inequality. And I'm going to spend most of the talk on that, and then, of course, trying to pull out some of the underlying psychological science, right, to illustrate the psychology that's underlying this. I'll spend a little bit of time talking about some of this, what I call sustaining myths, like why this is such an entrenched idea. And of course, it's supported by lots of smaller ideas, like any good mythology. And then I'll spend some time talking about what I see as some of the larger implications of this. All right, we're good? Okay, all right, let's go. Okay, so as I said, a lot of our work on this has been conducted examining how people think about racial economic equality, okay? So for instance, we ask people, Americans, questions like this. For every $100 of wealth accumulated by the average white family, how much wealth has the average black family accumulated? And we ask people to answer on a very easy slider scale, where 0 means white and black families have the same amount of wealth. Okay, feel free to play along at home. All right. So in this one study, I'm going to show the data for. This was we asked this of about 1,000 American adults that were selected to be nationally representative in terms of race, gender, age, income, education, other stuff. That's pretty much, you get all of them. And we asked that group to make these estimates across 12 different time points, starting in 1963 and ending in 2016, which was the current when we did the study. Okay. So a couple things. Here, I'm going to, on the y-axis is that estimate, right? What participants said on average black families had as a share of white family wealth, okay? So 0 to 100. And I'm going to plot those estimates for each of the 12 time points that people made judgments about. Right? Those are going to be the red dots. Okay. Then in yellow, I'm going to show the same estimates, but made based on data collected by the federal government. Turns out our government and friends of our government, Federal Reserve, I think they're friends, they collect data using very good methods on the same matters, on racial economic gaps, income, wealth, and any number of other matters. And so we can get what we would consider really strong benchmark data, right? Evidence of what reality is here, okay, for the same estimates. All right, so what did we find? This is what participants thought. Right? And consistent with the mythology or narrative of racial progress, participants thought that the black families had, oh, that's fancy. Okay, I was like, I'm making them look more wrong by the red dot. Okay, I would never do that to you. Okay, they thought that on average, black families had just less than half of the wealth of the average white family. Okay, and you can see those judgments of equality, right, how equal things are. So higher numbers mean people believe that wealth is more equal between black and white families. That inches up in this nice, beautiful linear pattern across time. And so by 2016, participants think that the racial wealth gap has all but closed, right? They say that black families have about 90% of the wealth of the average white family. Okay. This is reality, according to the best estimates by our federal government. And you can see, a few things. There has not been much progress toward closing the racial wealth gap over this time period, okay? Which means that because of this narrative of increasing linear, steady progress, although people are quite wrong about 1963, they're astoundingly wrong, absurdly wrong about the size of the racial wealth gap today, okay? So I hope to convince you point number one, we are operating influenced by this narrative, this mythology of racial progress. Okay? At least these data are certainly consistent with that. But I really want to take a minute to talk about this absurdly wrong estimate. It's hard to be this wrong about anything, right? And it's not, and we don't, we're shocked by it. And we're not in this business to show how bad and wrong people are, right? That's not our goal here. So it's worthy of attention to get a sense of how could anything lead people to be this wrong about something that's, somewhat observable in our environment, okay? And so here we've done a bunch of studies, I'll present one, but just I want to take a minute to suggest that this too, right, this really distorted perception of reality is caused by the racial progress narrative, right? If you believe that things must be better now than they were 10, 15, 20, 25 years ago, then once you've made a commitment to what the racial wealth gap was in 1963 or 1985, you have to make an estimate for today smaller, right? You guys with me? Okay. So we tested this in this idea that if time has passed, there must have been progress, kind of straightforward logic, in a study that we did lots of things in. So I'm not going to talk about the other things; they're not relevant to this right now. But what we did here was we had a subset of participants, again, a new sample of participants. Some of them just make that same estimate on the same slider scale for today, 2016. Okay, so they just made an estimate. What does the average black family have in wealth if the average white family has $100? Or they made that judgment after making the same judgment for 1963, okay? So either tell me what you think the racial wealth gap is today, or, okay, tell me what the racial wealth gap was in 1963. Okay, now tell me what it was today, all right? And what do we find? So here, when people just make an estimate for 2016, you see it's still wildly wrong, right? I mean, the truth at 2016 is about $10, okay, 10%. So people are still wrong, but they're not at 90, right? So you can see. What about when they do past and present, so 1963 and then the present? You see it's inflated, right? So it's this sense that, time, progress, okay, we must be more equal. You can see this logic happening and people conforming their estimates to that and not to maybe counter evidence in the world that racial equality still exists, okay? So this mythology of racial progress is important for a number of reasons, but I think one of the most important is that it distorts our perception of reality, right? We imagine things are better than they are, even when there's evidence to the contrary, okay? And just in case, you think, all right, Richeson, we saw that flat wealth, benchmark data. What if you use something where there actually has been progress, which there has. Incomes have increased. The black-white income gap has, shrunk some, quite a bit, actually, across time. So here are data on estimates of income gaps, right? Same slider scale, so no math involved, right? If, how much income does the average black family have if the average white family has $100, right? We asked that. These are data from 2 studies. On the y-axis here, we're now plotting people's estimates on average, but we've subtracted out the benchmark, so you can see that higher numbers are overestimates of equality. just like before, but there's also a possibility to underestimate, right? So there are some negative values here where people think that the past was worse than it actually was, right? Less equal than it actually was. Okay, so in both studies, we'll see for 1947, okay, and that's the time point, right? So we also wanted to pick a time point that wasn't in the 60s and maybe evoking imagery of progress and change and civil rights, okay? And this is a time point for which there are, as they all are, federal data on the matter, okay? So people were relatively accurate, okay? If anything, there's a tendency to be too pessimistic, right? And we see this pattern actually come up again and again. I can say something about that later. Okay, what about the present? This was the most recent data at the time we did the study was in 2013. You see again, people are overestimating. Okay, right? Again, this sort of distortion of reality, right? Seeing things as more equal than they are. Okay, so who does this, right? Who overestimates contemporary or current racial economic equality? We all do. Just raise your hand if you have overestimated. Okay, we all do. It is, again, the point of this is that this is part of our cultural dominance narrative, right? We're all doing this a bit, or to some a lot, okay? But in our data and in other data that others have collected, you do see patterns. So white Americans tend to overestimate the current state of racial economic equality and other forms of equality more than racial minority Americans. And high-income Americans do this more than their lower-income counterparts. The combination of those things also matters. So these are data from an early study we did. Again, on the y-axis are overestimates of current racial economic equality. It's a composite measure. And you can see here that high-income white, and we fielded the study on high and low-income white and black Americans, okay? That's who's in the sample. And you see high-income white Americans are overestimating more than their lower-income counterparts and lower than African-American participants of either income stratus, okay? So why, of course, this is multiply determined. Surely one cause is the racial and economic segregation of our nation, right? We do not live together, be it based on race or income, and certainly that intersection. In fact, there's lots of evidence to suggest that the highest income white Americans are actually the most segregated people in our country. They have the least exposure to people across income and racial divides. Okay, so that we don't get to see how race or income patterns other people's lives. And that information will be useful in making these judgments. Okay, but I'm a psychologist. What I've been focused on most is the underlying psychological science here, right? What people are focused on, how they might be motivated to make these judgments, and how those, especially those motives, shape what people, how they respond. Okay, so one of the, across all of our studies, one of the most clear and consistent findings is that the extent to which people believe a different narrative, a really important one, the American dream, predicts how much they overestimate equality, right? So the extent to which you believe that outcomes in life are really solely dependent on your talent, hard work, and effort, and wholly independent of structural barriers like racism, for instance, or economic disadvantage, the more you have, of course, the less you weigh those factors and the more you assume that then there must not be any racial differences, right? So we've studied this a bunch of ways. Mostly the cleanest way is looking at responses on a self-report scale called Belief in a Just World, which picks up on this type of idea. So for instance, I am confident that justice always prevails over injustice. I firmly believe that injustices of all areas of life are the exception rather than the rule. We know that higher income Americans tend to endorse these beliefs more than their lower income counterparts. White Americans tend to endorse it more than African Americans, right? You see where I'm going here? Okay. So Here I'm plotting, again, estimates of current racial economic inequality. The scores have been standardized, so they're not even there anymore, but again, higher scores mean greater overestimates, okay? And just what beliefs are on the X, okay? So the more you endorse this belief that the world is just and fair, you can see whether you're black or you're white, the more likely you are to overestimate equality, all right? The more likely you are to think that structural barriers, the very structural barriers that gave birth to and sustain racial wealth gaps, the more likely you're to discount them, right? To think that they don't exist anymore, okay? So, pure motive, right? A motivational account. But of course, something is happening between your motivation to see society as more equal and responding to the prompt, right? To that question about, in this case, the racial wealth gap. So we wanted to, try to understand some of the cognitive operations taking place. And here, we really just asked the question and had some anecdotal evidence that this might be going on. Like, what's happening, right? When people are, exposed to that very question, maybe, ask yourselves, when I asked you that question about how much wealth the average black family has compared to the average white family, did you think about a black family? Did you think about a black person, right? And so we had some anecdotal evidence that people do, and who they think of are not average black people. They think of LeBron James and Oprah and maybe Barack Obama, right? Highly successful black people. And of course, the extent to which you want to think society is very fair and equal and racially, that's who you should activate, even though that's not the stereotypical African American, that's not the typical African American, right? So we thought this might be going on. So we tested this in a very straightforward study. Again, participants did this slider scale of black-white wealth. Some, like everybody else, didn't have any, they had other information, but the same information they've always had, a definition of wealth. For instance, we did tell them what wealth was before we did this. I should have said that. But one was just a control condition that answered the questions in the same way that everybody else I just told you about in all the other studies. Then we had two other conditions, okay? One, we tried to mirror in some way what we thought people were doing anyway, right? And here it was, okay, meet America's top 5 black billionaires, okay? And we gave them information, and this was true at the time. These were America's top 5 billionaires. There were only 6 black billionaires at the time, but that's not the point, okay? So we're like, we're gonna activate some for you, okay? And then they did the slider scale measure. A third condition meet America's top billionaires. Of course, can you see that? They're all white men. But then just, as a aside, by the way, this guy is the top black billionaire, and this is how much wealth he has, right? A really sharp contrast that, if people are activating these types of folks, providing this information will bring them back into reality, we thought, or somewhere close. Now, we're talking about billionaires, so we're off reality anyway, okay? So we expected participants in the control to do something like they've done in all the other studies, right? When they're only asked about the wealth gap at a single point, right? And then we thought those in the black wealth salient would look very similar to control, and we thought those in this sort of inequality salient condition would temper, right? Lower their estimates, be more accurate, okay? And this is what we found, right? So the control and black wealth salient are not statistically different, although it is interesting that providing that information explicitly kind of gives it a little bit of a boost in the wrong direction. But you can see that providing that contrast reduces. They're like, oh, okay. At least that's what we think the emotions and sound effects are when people do this. Okay, so of course, right, motivations are shaping our cognitions, right? That's what our dear former president talked about, confirmation bias, right? You're looking for evidence that's consistent with what you want to, the outcome you want to see. But we think that the belief in the this progress narrative is also motivated, right? It does something for us to believe that society is going to ultimately be racially equal. In fact, that it's happening already on its own, right? It does something. It makes us feel better to think that we're better today than we were in 20 years ago, 40 years ago, 100 years ago, whatever the time might be, okay? So we thought, all right, if we're really going to change people's perceptions of today, we need to weaken a little bit their belief that progress has been made, right? That we are a more racially egalitarian country than we were in the 60s. So to do this, we again fielded a study on, this is of all white sample this time, and some of them were given information to suggest that racial bias continues to shape how people respond to others and the lives that people live. Okay, so something like this. Individuals harbor fairly high levels of racial bias, which contribute substantially to racial disparities in health, wealth, and overall well-being. Noting, although changes, right, things have changed since the 60s, right? So acknowledging things have changed. Some things haven't. Neighborhoods, schools, still segregated, workforce is still segregated, right? So just a little bit like, yes, things have changed, but maybe not as much as you thought, okay? People got this. The other half of the sample read about left-handedness, just an easy control, okay? And then they did the same measure for 1963 and for 2016, okay? All right, so what do we expect? It's bad when you start with what you expected. Okay. So we thought we would get something like this, right? That participants, like in all the other studies, would in the control condition would be like, yes, things are much, much better now, right? So black and white Americans are more equal in their wealth than in the past, okay? And we expected the treatment condition would also feel this way, but they would be, like their slope would be shallower, right? They're like, well, yeah, that's still true, but maybe not as true as I thought it was, okay? We're good? All right. So what did we find? Yes, the control condition did what they do, okay? But the racism treatment condition, so those who read about the continuing legacy, ongoing influence of racial bias, did produce a shallower slope. So we did expect that. However, instead of updating what they thought about the present, they updated what they thought about the past. They said, oh, okay, well, if things have not changed as much as I thought since the 60s, then things must not have been as unequal as I thought in the 60s. If we had not made as much progress as I thought, then perhaps racial inequality in the past was not as bad as I thought. Okay. Now you all want to be psychologists, don't you? Right? It's fascinating. And we did replicate this immediately because we thought surely this was a fluke. But no, we replicated it. It doesn't matter if you think about implicit bias now versus before it. You get the same effect, okay? All right, so disrupting that progress narrative is not enough, we found out. And when I wrote about this in the Atlantic piece that Margaret mentioned, the editors for the online edition basically forced this headline on me, which I guess they're right, but because Americans are determined to believe in Black progress, racial progress, whether it's happening or not. And I think they're not wrong, right? We are determined, we're invested in this narrative, for better or for worse. Okay, so what is sustaining this, right? What's happening here? Many things, of course, and including the fact that this story, right, should sound familiar. It's in our media, it's in our stories, like the best actor, but not best actor, the Oscar for like best picture always goes to like when it's a race story, it's like one that has this pattern, right? So we love this story. Okay, it's very redemptive, all right? But like any good mythology, there are myths, right? Just like Achilles and Hercules, right? Same thing, you got some myths that help undergird this larger mythology, to help us, that remind us that yes, you're right, things are getting better, and this is how, right? So these myths, I want to point out, are based on things in society, dynamics in society, that are also changing over time and seem, at least on the surface, and maybe actually reasonably, are vehicles for racial change, right? For racial equity. Okay, so they're not unrealistic beliefs to have. It just turns out that they're not. It's not guaranteed, right? There's counter evidence that these changes will actually bring in the changes that people think they will. Okay, so what are they? For instance, one is as the country's becoming more racially diverse, right? It will also become more egalitarian. I mean, you must have heard this one, right? Many of you believe. Don't be shy if you believe this one. It's okay. All right, and it's not impossible, right? The country is actually becoming more racially diverse, right? And we know that more interracial contact can soften bigotry, increase tolerance, right? It's tough. I had a whole first 10 years of my career were examining these types of dynamics between interracial interactions. But we also know it's this very change in our country in particular, but also replicating in other countries, this shift in the number of racial minorities. In fact, the concern about white Americans becoming less than 50% of the population, that is activating what sociologists in the 50s, right, told us about, called group status threat. And this sense of concern about the loss of status, whether it's social, political, economic, or cultural, in society, right, of members of dominant groups, we know leads to a cascade of outcomes that are not compatible with a more racially just or democratic society, for that matter. Okay, so we can't count on the increasing diversity to fix this for us. Okay, another sort of, part of this one is the, okay, well, they'll be so diverse that everybody will marry each other and they'll be biracial and multiracial kids. The Browning of America, right, this version of it, will also make us more racially egalitarian. Lots of smart people believe this. I'm friends with some of these people. And they are smart. And it's not that it couldn't happen, again. It's just that in this country, and in South Africa, and in Brazil, and in many other places, the increases in the number of multiracial, mixed race people has been counted, right? Monitored. Scientific results depend on doing so correctly, right? These are instructions from the census and about race, identifying race in 1870. Here's 1890, right? Right, white, black, mulatto, quadroon, octoroon, Chinese. Mulatto, quadroon, octoroon are all different degrees of mixed racedness, okay? Be particularly careful to distinguish between the blacks, the regular blacks, and the mulattoes, the quadroon, right? I mean, we've done this before, and believe me, I hope you believe me in suggesting that this did not lead us to a more racially egalitarian country, right? So, unlikely. Since I'm in Silicon Valley and prompted by our good president, former president's talk today, this one is also another one, right? Once we get rid of human decision makers because we are hopelessly biased, whether it's explicit or implicit or ignorant or wrong, whatever, and replace the decision makers with technology, maybe AI, right, which is happening, that will lead us to be more racially egalitarian. All right, moving along. There's lots of evidence, more and more, building that absolutely not, right? If anything, it exacerbates, it scales up the biases that already exist in our country. And this, really amazing but horrifying paper came out a couple years ago by a group at University of Chicago showing exactly how an algorithm was used, that's heavily used in hospitals to assign treatment, was assigning less treatment, fewer black patients to the same treatment as whites, even though the black patients were sicker. Okay, so scaled up incredibly quickly and in devastating ways. And my favorite, I don't know why it is. People get so upset when I tell them this one. I hope you're not among them. When, the old people who are bigots are gone, and the young people take over because they're so enlightened, we'll be fine. The children, right? They will save us. Children in the room, I'm sorry. We've abdicated our responsibility to you to fix society's ills. One, it's irresponsible. Two, it's just unlikely to happen, right? It's not, this assumption is that, well, they are more, they're not hung up with all this race stuff, right? They have better attitudes. But the reality is every effort to look at this suggests actually that's not quite right. White children of various generations, including millennials and Gen Z, have racial attitudes on many explicit outcomes, all implicit outcomes that are as biased as their parents, grandparents, and generations ahead of them, right? So this is just it's just not true. I mean, this younger generation looks more racially tolerant because they're more racially diverse, right? That's unearthing. If you just look at the population of whites, it's not there, right? And of course, to believe this, we have to ignore, again, counter evidence of very young people who are perfectly interested and attracted to white nationalist efforts, okay? All right. So let me just say another thing about sustaining myths, and there are others. I just wanted to throw a few in there to upset your day. One thing that's striking to me about this is that each of these changes, right, is gradual, right? And just like the racial progress narrative, it's like, okay, as the country becomes more this, we'll become more egalitarian, right? And therefore, it's a very hands-off approach to racial justice, right? We don't have to do anything. It's happening. Just wait it out. Okay. But of course, this possibility, that plan or lack of plan, right? Think about who then is waiting while they're also suffering the indignities of inequality and injustice, often deadly outcomes of injustice, right? And then think about the frustration you might hear when someone says, oh, well, when this thing happens in 20, 40, 50 years, you'll be free. It's, you can imagine the frustration. In fact, it makes me think about this oft-cited and important quote from James Baldwin on progress, where he says, you always told me it takes time. It's taken my father's time, my mother's time, my uncle's time, my brother's and my sister's time, my nieces and my nephew's time. How much time do you want for your progress? Right? And that's a question that we all need to consider. What are we doing right now in the face of the evidence that our that we are incredibly still structurally racially unjust? All right, so I hope I'm sure you agree with this. I think you do. This mythology, this racial progress narrative exists. I hope you believe with that. And it's seductive, right? It is nicer to think about this, predestined outcome of racial equity that will happen at some point. In fact, it's happening. We're on the road, right? Every now and then we get off track, but once we get back on track, it's just going to keep going. Okay, right? It's a moral argument. And like any good mythology, it involves some sort of supernatural entities, magical thinking a bit. But it's inspiring, right? I mean, it is this, right? The quote popularized by Martin Luther King Jr., the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. But because it's so seductive, it's corrosive. It can be, right? I already hope I convinced you that it can, and often does, distort our perceptions of current racial equality. We look for evidence that progress is happening, and we ignore evidence of backlash, right, or lack of, or stasis, okay? And it's this focus on evidence of progress that we know from lots of studies undermines support for actual efforts, policy change, to support racial equality. In fact, you can, so the logic is this, right? We're making progress anyway, right? We're converging on it anyway. Why do we need to implement policies, right? To increase diversity, to change how we fund schools, right? You can see the racial progress narrative animating Chief Justice John Roberts' majority opinion in the Shelby County versus Holder case that struck down a key component of the Voting Rights Act, right? He says, nearly 50 years later, things have changed dramatically. There is no doubt that these improvements are in large part because of the thing I'm about to take away, the Voting Rights Act. But the act proved immensely successful at redressing racial discrimination and integrating the voting process. Okay, yes, but then there's an assumption that society or the people in the places that were covered by the act that had long histories of racial discrimination had somehow also been transformed, right? So we don't need policy. People, of course, are more egalitarian than they used to be. Of course, this has proved to be incorrect. Even in upholding affirmative action in college admissions, Justice O'Connor at the time said, it has been 25 years. Okay, again, time means progress, no matter what. Since Justice Powell first approved the use of race to further an interest in student body diversity in the context of public higher education. Since that time, the number of minority applicants with high grades and test scores has indeed increased. We expect in another 25 years, the use of racial prevalence will no longer be necessary to further an interest approved today, right? Because, of course, it just will take some time and we'll be all set, right? The narrative, right? My friends, my only argument is that we need to live in reality and not mythology, right? This amazing Freddie Gray, cover after the Freddie Gray murder in Baltimore, our hometown, and the uprising that happened then, it's cover of Time magazine, right? Is it 1968? No, make that 2015, right? Some things don't seem to have changed so much. Of course, some things have, and we need to do a careful accounting and not be afraid to say what has and what has not changed, okay? So reality is that US neighborhoods are more segregated than they were a generation ago, right? Perpetuating and perpetuated by racial inequality, right? The wealth gap I talked about, plus racial segregation, residential segregation, means that, and the way schools are funded, means that white school districts are far more funded than the school districts that minority kids go to, right? So the wealth gap is an opportunity gap, and it keeps cycling, feeding each other, all right? And in a, less severe case, but one that people have been talking about lately. This is an interesting graph of the number of minority, really just black head coaches in the NFL from '89 to 2017. And note here was when the policy of the Rooney Rule, right, where you had to interview at least one black person for the job was implemented because there were only two head coaches in the league. There are 32 teams, turns out. Okay, and you can see after that, there's this nice increase. There's up and down, up and down, up and down. What do you guys think the number of head coaches in the NFL is right now? 2. Okay, and so it's not, again, this is a realistic picture of actual progress, change, where we are, right? There's up and down. Then there's an alarm, a policy implemented that may or may not be effective for a certain amount of time. And then often there's complete regression, right? That's why it looks flat, because you just capture the picture at the right or wrong moment. But you can see there is change. There has been change. We often, though, undermine it by undoing the policies or not implementing the policies that are responsible for change and assuming that the thing that's changing are the people, the decision makers, and relying on that. And that's just not a realistic way to do it. All right, so I just, I don't want to get in trouble. This is videotaped. It's too late. I am not saying that there has been no progress in any way on anything. right? We have made progress, right? I hope I've suggested that. And of course, there have been incredibly symbolic and important changes in our country as of late, and not just the use of colored pictures. Right? And this is, evidence of progress toward gender equality, toward racial equality, right? It's really remarkable. And I remember talking to my now deceased grandmother when Barack Obama was elected and her crying on the phone. I did not think this would happen in my lifetime, right? That happened. It's real. It's important to document, okay? But it's also important to remember, especially in this case, but in almost all cases of significant change toward a more racially inclusive society, something like this happened the next day, the next week, the next year, right? This happened too, right? And these things happened. Widespread, uncontrolled, unchecked efforts to change election laws that, will advantage Republicans, but of course, the primary route of doing this is by disenfranchising racial minorities, right? Okay, that's happening too. And so my suggestion is that we pay attention to both of these things, not just the ones that feel like progress. Okay, so I've been at CASBS for a minute. I came in hot with, we need reality, not mythology. And some of the feedback that I got during my time here was, that's really negative, Jen. Where is the hope? was said to me, and I took that in. And so I'm revising myself with my red pen. And so we need, I do think we need to eschew mythology, but that sounds hard. So how about this? We can decide together. We need reality plus possibility. So what does that look like? I went on a search. What does that look like? And I found these words from Bernice King, the daughter of Martin Luther King Jr. And this resonated. I'll see how it feels to you. Being truthful about the state of our nation and world does not equal losing hope. Hope seeks truth and still believes in better and is willing to strategize and work for it. And she goes on, that which dismisses or does not seek truth but says it will be okay is naivete, not hope. That's the piece of the mythology I want to set aside. The possibility, the inspiring part, I want to hold fast to and in. I'll give our former president the last word. In other words, the arc of the moral universe may bend towards justice, but it doesn't bend on its own. So I invite you to be a part of bending the arc. Before I close, let me just acknowledge the team of people who worked on this with me, most notably Michael Krause, who's a professor at the Yale School of Management, and a slew of current and former postdocs, PhD students, undergraduate, honors thesis students, grad students, all of the above who worked on this data. I also, if you indulge me for a couple more minutes, really want to acknowledge this community. My time at CASBS has been, I'm not joking, incredibly wonderful and meaningful and improved my work and made me think about many different things about my work differently, but also about the world. And so I'm incredibly grateful for all of you, definitely, especially you, Margaret, and Sally, and all of the staff. Just been incredible, as well as many of the ghosts in the studies, including Jennifer Eberhardt and Hazel Marcus and Larry Bobo and Sandy Darity and people whose work I call on all the time inspire me. I want to mention just two ghosts in the studies and sadly ghosts in the literal sense. One, these are my graduate advisors in graduate school, Herb Kellman, who passed away just a month or so ago. Just shy of his 95th birthday. He was born in Vienna, and his family fled the Nazis, first to Belgium, then to the United States. And, he was very involved in the civil rights movement, including desegregating the Woolworths in Baltimore while he was a postdoc at Johns Hopkins with his wife, Rose, who were incredibly lovely. Nalini, who was a faculty member here, passed away in 2013 at 54 from leukemia. An immigrant from India, and even in her brief life made outsized contributions to social psychology, but also the utility, she believed in the utility of social psychology for addressing societal problems, and that led her to think of and co-found Stanford Spark, social psychological answers to real-world questions. So if you don't know about Spark, check them out. Currently directed by Jennifer Eberhardt, who's here. So I learned very different things from the two of them. But most importantly, they believe that social psychology theory, findings, methods, all of it should and could be used to promote societal equity, justice, and peace. And needless to say, they encouraged me to nurture that impulse, to go with it. And I certainly wouldn't be doing what I do without them, and would not be winning this prize. And last, I just want to shout out my people, and I mean that broadly, the generations of Black Americans in this country who sought for, worked for, fought for, and died for freedom and justice. I also mean my very real family, the Stovall's and the Richesons. Sorry, I don't have a picture of y'all, but you did too. But I also come from a long line of people, especially women, who believed in service, in purpose, in scholarship, and certainly demanded the highest levels of excellence from each other and of me, and I appreciate who they have turned me into, and I can't not acknowledge them. Often people ask me why I do what I do, and there are lots of answers to that question, but probably the most honest is because my grandma told me to. Thank you all.
Okay. You know how heavy that is. Okay. Jen, it has been wonderful to be with you and to have our interview this afternoon, to be able to talk before and after. I knew you earned this award and you deserved it. I'm overwhelmed by actually being with you and being able to hand you this very heavy, very heavy, wait a minute, very heavy award.
Thank you, it is heavy.
And a sort of much less heavier but equally felt check.
Thank you so much.
And let's give her a big hand. You were great. Those colors were fantastic.
Thank you. Thanks everyone.
Okay. Thank you all.